Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Ron Gauthier. I'm the branch manager of the Grayson Branch Library, part of the Gwinnett County Public Library System. Today we will commemorate the 150th year anniversary of the 15th Amendment, an extraordinary time where former slaves integrated into freedom and got the right to vote. We will also pay tribute to 4 civil rights icons that we lost in 2020. We will also pay tribute to the thousands of civil rights workers over 150 years who fought for the right to vote. And what we hope to do with you is inspire and empower you with this information to exercise your constitutional and fundamental right, and that's the right to vote. At the end of the Civil War, it was an extraordinary time in our country. And it also had some unlimited prospects and possibilities for freedmen who finally made their way into the mainstream society. But something else happened at that time that was equally remarkable, and it speaks to just how revolutionary the time was for us. We'll start with Sherman's famous March to the Sea. William Tecumseh Sherman, part of his plan to break the spirits of the Confederacy, was marching through Atlanta, through the South to Savannah. On his route, as he was moving along, he had some logistical problems he had to deal with. Now, he was burning down plantation houses if necessary, detonating railroad cars with Confederate ammunition, and anything else that was an obstacle to him. But there was another problem. As he moved forward, he was getting a large number of ex-slaves following his army. Now, the problem was he didn't have the provisions for them. He didn't have food, he didn't have water, and at one point they were slowing down his line. They became an obstacle. Some of them he could actually use to work, to remove down trees. Some of them could actually clear pathways. So there was some work they could do, and they were very useful and helpful, but he still had a large number that at one point numbered in the thousands following him. So an incident occurred at Ebenezer Creek. Now, Ebenezer Creek was located about 18 miles out of Savannah. So under the cover of night, his Corps of Engineers erected a pontoon bridge. And he told the slaves that they would have to cross the bridge first because the Confederate army could be on the other side. So once it was hastily erected, it was hastily taken down. The slaves were left on one side to fend for themselves. So in terror and panic, they tried to cross the creek by themselves. Many of them drowned in the water. The others on the other side were recaptured by the Confederate army that was suddenly upon them. One of the soldiers, General Kerr, who was with the Chicago 18th Cavalry, stated in his diary that, "I saw something that I hope my eyes will never see again. I saw women and children drowning in the cold, clutching water." Now, this story actually made its way into the media, and it also made its way to Washington, D.C., to William Stanton, who was the Secretary of War. Now, Stanton decided he wanted to visit Sherman to investigate this and to also talk to him about the issues of refugees subtly showing at Union camps throughout the country. So they decided to meet in Savannah, and he also met with 20 leaders of the black community in Savannah, Georgia. So they asked these men, "What do you want with your newfound freedom?" This was spectacular because no one had ever asked them what they thought about this whole situation. So they spoke resoundingly, all of them unanimous in the fact that they wanted land. They wanted rich alluvial soil that they could toil and till and turn, that they've already done for somebody else's wealth. Now, there was some land available. There was some Confederate property that was confiscated by the federal government, starting in South Carolina, in the coastal area, down to Georgia island areas, all the way to Florida, 400,000 acres of land. So General Sherman decided what they could do is redistribute that land to the ex-slaves. That way they could empower them with something that they could be self-sufficient with, and they would also stop following his army. So they redistributed the land to these men and families in 40-acre plots. So they got 40 acres, and as the army moved on, they decided to leave them a mule. And that's where you got 40 acres and a mule. This became an official program to empower ex-slaves with their own land. It was entitled Special Field Order Number 15. President Lincoln also signed it. So Eric Foner, who's a popular historian, said, "Can you imagine race relations in this country had this actually worked? Had we actually kept this program and made sure it was eligible to other ex-slaves in the country, could you imagine the type of wealth that could have been passed on from family to family? So it was a great program, very meaningful, but unfortunately it was also short-lived, which brings us to our president. So President Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States of America, was also overseeing a really serious moral, constitutional, and political problem, and that was the Civil War. He also oversaw slaves asking for freedom, and he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, suddenly freeing 3.9 million slaves. Now, his successor, his ultimate successor, who was his current vice president, Andrew Johnson, and he had similarities and big differences. Both of these men were reared in poverty. They found a magnificent way to pull themselves up, to ascend to the prestigious position of President of the United States of America. But this is where the actual ideologies differed. Lincoln supported freeing the slaves. He was assassinated. His successor, Andrew Johnson, became the President of the United States. Now, both of these men didn't really embrace the planter class or the planter elite in society, but they learned to work with them. But one thing for certain is Andrew Johnson had a special disdain for these 3.9 million ex-slaves suddenly stumbling into freedom. He was not a friend of the ex-slave. So he developed, unfortunately, enemies in the radical Republican Congress. Now bear in mind that the radical Republicans, or the Republican Party, was the party of Lincoln, and that would become the party of the ex-slaves as well. The Democratic Party at that time was the party of the Confederacy. So under Johnson's tenure, one of the first things he did was he pardoned all of the ex-Confederates and didn't make it difficult for them to rejoin the Union. And one of the things he did that was catastrophic to the growth and economic freedom of African Americans was he immediately nullified Special Field Order 15. So all of those slaves who were now living on this land, they had to return it to the former owners. And so this special program didn't live 1 year. Now under his time as the president, a Special Reconstruction Act of 1867 was passed. Part of it had a Military Reconstruction Act component. And how that worked was this. There were 10 rebel states. All of them would be integrated into 5 military units. And the responsibility of the units was to ensure the safety of the people and that civil rights were being protected. Also, it required all of the states involved to rewrite their constitution so that they could rejoin the Union. Now, Johnson was totally 100% against this, and he vetoed it. It was an override by Congress. And we see this happen often. Under Johnson, black codes developed, which were very restrictive to the newly freed slaves. Under Johnson, he did not support the 14th Amendment. He did not support the 15th Amendment. So there was always this difficulty, but he had a new adversary, or a group of adversaries in Congress, in that there were radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens, who actually worked toward his impeachment. Johnson became the first president in United States history at that time to undergo impeachment proceedings. He was fortunate in that he was just 1 vote shy of being actually impeached. So after Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant became the President of the United States on March 4, 1869. Now Johnson was a well-known Union veteran, and he was also a Union hero, and then he commanded the armies of the North, the whole Union Army. So Johnson was also an abolitionist. He was born to an abolitionist family. When he was married, at the wedding, his father refused to attend because his father-in-law owned slaves. So he was, as Frederick Douglass would say, he was the friend of the Negro, most definitely. So under Johnson, some amazing things happened. The 15th Amendment was passed. He supported the 14th Amendment. The Justice Department developed, and they were necessary to help deal with this rise in Ku Klux Klan terrorism throughout the country. He also implemented the Ku Klux Klan Act. So Johnson stood over some extraordinarily revolutionary civil rights to help African Americans. Many historians state to this day that Ulysses S. Grant, at his time, was one of the presidents who did more for African Americans in the country than any other time until Lyndon B. Johnson in the 60s. So the 15th Amendment passed, this extraordinary amendment that provided free, unfettered access to the voting booth for former slaves, African Americans. If you look at this picture and notice the third man in line, he's wearing a Union uniform. He's typical of many of the ex-slaves at that time. So he may have been a slave who escaped, joined the Union Army up north, fought for the Union Army, and at that time, he got a political view on how he could be a man and a citizen and help his people move up. So like William Ward in Louisiana, who was an ex-slave, who eventually escaped, fought for the Union Army, came back to Louisiana, and he actually was elected as a state representative, and also he became the captain of the Louisiana State Militia, powerful position for a former slave. So we saw unlimited possibilities happening throughout the country. The first person, Mr. Purley, who pulled the booth. Then we saw Hiram Revels from Mississippi, the first African American to become a United States Senator. Also, Mr. Lone from Georgia, here in the state, he actually became the first African American to speak on the United States representative floor. Now, bear in mind, during this time when African Americans were voting, putting people into office, we had almost 2,000 positions of both elected and appointed positions. So not only do you have senators, but you also have appointed positions like postmaster, tax collector. You had African Americans who served as magistrates. And as I mentioned earlier, some of them were even captains of state militias. And here are the first black members of the United States Congress. You can see Hiram Revels on the side. You know, Grant, during the first year of his presidency, he had his customary way of refurbishing things. He decided to make the capital city a showcase place. So he immediately started installing drainage systems, lampposts, paving roadways, moving railroad tracks. And Frederick Douglass, the great orator, and probably one of the most prominent civil rights leaders who ever lived, stated in observing this that these black men we watched with pitchforks, tools, they were rebuilding the Capitol. And not surprisingly, slaves had actually done these capital works projects many times. They even built the Capitol. So he was proud and he marveled at the fact that these men standing with pitchforks were being compensated for their work. But what was even more marveling to him was right down the road, Hiram Revels in a tailor-made suit and top cap walked right into the United States Senate. So these were really amazing times. In Louisiana, James Dunn became the first African-American lieutenant governor of the state, one of the first. He died in 1871 of pneumonia, and he was immediately replaced by P.B.S. Pinchback, who, while he was in office as the lieutenant governor, Governor Warthput of Louisiana underwent impeachment proceedings, and he was removed from office. The state senate decided to select P.B.S. Pinchback to temporarily hold this position. At that time, P.B.S. Pinchback became the very first governor of African descent in American history, even though he was there about 31 days. Now, bear in mind, this political ascendancy and assertiveness among African Americans brought on a horrible backlash from insurgents and former Confederates who felt that they were moving too quickly. So in Colfax, Louisiana, there was an election, and some of the members of the state militia were protecting the courthouse and the elected officials from a takeover from insurgents who decided that they shouldn't be there. So as they circled the courthouse, there were maybe 300 men, a paramilitary group, that decided they should be removed. There was a gun battle. All 150 men were killed, some of them inside the courthouse, some of them as they fled, some as they tried to hold a truce. Others were taken prisoner, then eventually executed. Now, this was an extraordinary event, and it was a double massacre because not only did we have a loss of lives, but a case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court as Crawshank versus the United States. The United States Supreme Court decided at that time that the federal government was not responsible for protecting anybody from a private citizen. It had to be a state institution. So essentially, what that did was it watered down the 14th Amendment, and this allowed, and unfortunately, a lot of mob violence to continue throughout the country. So the Ku Klux Klan, which was very rampant at that time, started out in 1866 in Tennessee as sort of like a ghoulish joke to scare African Americans. They became one of the most powerful terrorist groups in the country. One of the things they decided to do was to ensure that African Americans did not vote and to remove those who were voting and those in office who totally supported them. So they inflicted violence, subjected the community to all sorts of atrocities. There were beatings, there were floggings, there were assassinations, and sometimes there were actual massacres that happened throughout the country. Other groups that would develop with a similar ideology would be the Red Shirts and also the Knights of the White Camellia. So in 1876, it was an extraordinary presidential election, Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden. Now, a deal was made that if Rutherford B. Hayes would be willing to remove all of the federal troops out of the southern states, especially Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, where they were heavily planted, and those states also had Republican governors. If he was willing to remove those federal troops, he would become the president. So in 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes became the president of the United States, and after 12 years, under military occupation, the southern states were left to themselves. That was the end of Reconstruction. He immediately withdrew all of the federal troops from the South. Now, as you can imagine, this brought on even more violence. The Equal Justice Initiative reports recently did a study and determined that over 2,000 black people were lynched from 1865 to 1877, which was the length of the Reconstruction era. Now, keep in mind, when they talk about these lynchings, they're not mentioning the massacres that also occurred. So the numbers of violence against African Americans who resist voter oppression was very, very high. In 1898, in Wilmington, North Carolina, it was an extraordinary city in that it was 56% African American, and African Americans were actually doing quite well there. There were 10 police officers, there were 3 black aldermen, there was a black newspaper, and also there were African Americans who were physicians, teachers, and so on and so forth. So the insurgents decided they wanted to take over the government, make it democratic and white all over again. So a campaign was started, and one evening, the Red Shirts, there was a popular group known for wearing red shirts, blazing with Winchester rifles and pistols. So they rode into the town, and they terrified the children and women, and they killed 60 black men in an area. So the captain, who was also a former United States Senator, former Confederate general, he actually wanted to become the mayor of Wilmington, North Carolina. So he approached City Hall, and he forced the current police chief, mayor, the 3 aldermen, and all other politicians to leave immediately. This was the first official coup, an actual overtaking of a legally elected government in United States history. I would say probably next to what happened in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873. So the violence was rampant, and the violence helped to really, really reduce the voter rolls. And so some of the politicians decided now they needed another technique. They needed to be a way to develop legislation that could help them very cleverly circumvent the 15th Amendment. One of those was the convict leasing system. Now this worked in that states could actually arrest people on frivolous charges and actually re-enslave them to a degree. The state would sell them to plantations, railroad companies, mining companies, and the men would actually work under horrible conditions. So not only are they now re-enslaved, but also because of their incarceration status, they're ineligible to vote. Another piece of legislation was the literacy test, called the Literacy Clause. So now African Americans who registered to vote were required to pass this test. It was a written part, and there was an oral part where you were required to read to the voter of registrar's satisfaction anything they decided to give you. It could be a constitutional piece, whatever. Now, the problem with this is it also discriminated against a large number of poor whites. So another clause was developed, the grandfather clause. And essentially what it meant was if your grandfather or any of his lineal descendants had voted in an election prior to 1867, you would qualify to vote and the literacy clause would be waived. it passed out of Oklahoma. Then there was the poll tax. You had to pay to vote. Poll taxes, bear in mind, were really expensive. They were equivalent in some cases to a full day's wages. So some people just could not do it. And then there was the notorious all-white primary. So in Texas, the Texas state legislature actually enacted an ordinance that African Americans could not be a part of the primary party, that it would be a private club. Now, it was interesting because in a Democratic state, one-party system, the primary party was the party that really mattered. The general election was simply a formal acknowledgement of the primary party's choice. So essentially, this led to disenfranchisement of African Americans. So as you could imagine, the voting rolls of African Americans actually plummeted. The NAACP, during one of their meetings in 1909, decided that voter suppression and voter discrimination would be an area they needed to deal with. They got an interesting case, which was the grandfather clause, that they were able to file a lawsuit, take it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, Gwynn versus the United States. In 1915, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the grandfather clause was unconstitutional and struck it down. So for the NAACP, this was their very first Supreme Court case and their first victory. So there was a taste to get out there and fight again. Near the turn of the century, a brilliant young man attended Paul Laurence Dunbar High School. He went on to Amherst College, and then he went to the prestigious Harvard Law School. In fact, he was the first black student to edit the Harvard Law Review. He went to the Army and then eventually became a college instructor at Howard University. He eventually became the dean of the law school. What he did to change the law school was absolutely legendary. He got it accepted by the American Bar Association. He implemented the first of its kind, a civil rights training division for lawyers. He also got support from Harvard, and he was sometimes found guilty of Harvardizing Howard, which was not necessarily a bad thing. One of his students that he mentored and really was proud of was a precocious young man by the name of Thurgood Marshall. Once they finished and left Howard Law School, both of them would join the NAACP, and both of them would become part of its first legal defense fund. They would take on a number of cases in civil rights, desegregation cases, unequal teacher pay, but most especially voting rights. A case they took back in 1944 was against the all-white primary. Dentist Lonnie Smith applied to register to vote and to become a member of the primary party, and he was denied membership. The case was eventually brought up all the way up to the Supreme Court and argued by Thurgood Marshall, and the Supreme Court struck down the all-white primaries as totally unconstitutional and in violation of the 15th Amendment. Thurgood Marshall said very comfortably that this case was one of the most important cases in his entire career. Also, it was very popular at that time. Newspapers throughout the country quoted African Americans as saying this case is the actual second Emancipation Proclamation. So this was really popular, and groups decided to continue this fight for voter rights. So some of the groups that had been around for years, like National Council of Negro Women, NAACP, they decided to do subsidiaries so that they could get younger people to join the party. The SCLC developed a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And one of the things they wanted to attack in the country is that voter discrimination. Now, bear in mind, in the 1860s, shockingly enough, some of the violence that prevailed against activists of voting was so similar to what happened in the 1860s. Here's a picture of Levi Allen. He is one of the militiamen in Louisiana during the Colfax Massacre. There he is with his men trying to protect the courthouse. To the right-hand side, Congressman John Lewis, at age 25, is trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to get to the courthouse in Dallas County. And as you can see, he was attacked by state troopers. We would see this extraordinary outbreak of violence. The Klan even returned to full-fledged attacks. We would see assaults on individuals, assassinations. We would see church burnings, home burnings, and continuous assaults to stop people from wanting this right to vote. In Mississippi, civil rights workers Michael Henry Schwerner, James Earl Chaney, and Andrew Goodman were investigating the burnings of churches there they were also involved in a voter registration drive. All three men disappeared one night after they were arrested for supposedly speeding. 41 days of search ensued, and they were eventually found buried in an earthen dam. The sheriff, one of the sheriff deputies, was also indicted on this crime of murder, as well as members of the Ku Klux Klan. So this was the climate in the 60s. The violence was really, really, really amazing. Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a sharecropper for 17 years, actually joined a group called the Democratic Freedom Party. The goal of this interracial group was to get the Democratic Party to seat a person of color in their organization. So she spoke at their meeting, and surprisingly, she wasn't supposed to be the main speaker. It was supposed to be Martin Luther King. This humble woman talked about the experiences she endured being jailed, beaten, threatened, thrown off the plantation. In her powerful voice, she became overnight a sensation. MEDGAR, who was a field director for the NAACP, who was responsible for a voter registration drive there, was viciously assassinated by white supremacist Byron Della Beckwith right in front of his home. Now, the activists created an atmosphere of resistance, nonviolent resistance, that eventually led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 being signed by Andrew Johnson. And then the following year, as they continued their protests, as they continued their fight against discrimination, the Edmund Pettus Bridge incident was seen worldwide as African Americans who only wanted to vote who were attacked by state troopers. This led to, in many ways, the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, in which Lyndon B. Johnson stated, "We too shall overcome." So this led to the voting rules actually just suddenly skyrocketing as African Americans registered to vote again. We had not seen this type of activity since the 1860s. In 1967, two African American men, Carl Stokes and Michael Richard Hatcher, became the first African American mayors in 1967. Both of them elected about maybe 3 months apart. And we know that in 2008, Barack Obama became the first African American president of the United States. And in many speeches, he thanked everyone who was involved in this whole struggle for voters' rights for over 115 years for making this even possible. In 2013, the United States Supreme Court struck down a very serious provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There was an act that required governments to get permission from the federal government to ensure that everything was working properly, that there was no discrimination. Well, the Supreme Court ruled in 2013 that this is no longer 1965. Things are different in 2013, and it's not needed. Barack Obama, who delivered the eulogy at Congressman John Lewis's funeral, talked about voter suppression and other tactics that were actually occurring throughout the country to make it difficult for people of color to vote. This was an extraordinary experience. So I hope that you enjoyed this presentation and you will exercise your constitutional right. Let me share with you some items at the library available to check out now that deal very deeply with this subject. Give Us the Ballot, One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson, who actually spoke here at the library before. Stolen Justice. There's also Capital Men, the story of the very first congressman in our country, African American. Slavery by Another Name, a Pulitzer Prize winning book, actually goes into detail about convict leasing in the South. Red River by Lolita Tatamy. It's a novel, a fictionalized account of the Colfax Massacre in 1873. Devil in the Grove, which won a Pulitzer Prize, an extraordinary book. Roots and Branch, if you really want the story of Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and an amazing crusade to stop discrimination in the country, it's a must-read. Freedom Lawmakers, Williamton's Lie. I spoke to you earlier about the Williamton Massacre of 1898. Here's a current book about it that's very, very well done. And of course, we have a large number of resources at the library in print form and also available online. If you go to our website, go to our database page, you will find a plethora of information to help you with your search. So we look forward to you exercising your constitutional right. Get out there and vote.